Good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome. My name is Catherine Kavesi, and I'm the current head of the discipline of history here at the University of Melbourne. And I'll be emceeing tonight's events, our Kathleen Fitzpatrick lecture, and the announcement of the award of this year's Ernest Scott Prize. It's wonderful to have so many of you with us here this evening. Gungaloo activist Lilla Watson famously declared, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." It's in this spirit of working together with the mental liberation that academic work of careful and often painful thinking engenders that I wish to open this evening, both to acknowledge those on whose lands I am sitting here this evening at the University of Melbourne, who never ceded it, the elders, past, present, and emerging of the Bunurong, Bunwarang, and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, but also to introduce a lecture dealing with another peoples who are fighting for their lives and with their lives for land that they too do not want to cede. Before I have the privilege of introducing our speaker, Mark Edele, I want to outline the proceedings and practicalities of the evening. Mark will speak for about 40 minutes. We'll then have questions for up to 15 minutes. And if you have a question, you'll need to use the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your webinar screen in the menu bar there, and type in your question there, which I'll then convey to Mark. After the time for questions, I'll introduce the books that have been shortlisted for this year's Ernest Scott Prize and then announce the winning outcome. So please stay on after the lecture and questions finish. Tonight's lecture would normally be given in person in the lecture theatre named after the woman whom this lecture also honours, Kathleen Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick, born in 1905 and who died in 1990, was initially rebuffed on her first job application at the University of Melbourne because as a woman, she was advised there were only jobs at the university for secretarial work for women. But she persevered and was appointed to a lectureship in 1937, which increased the history staff from 2 to 3 members. In 1948, she became the first woman in Australia outside the natural sciences appointed to the position of associate professor, and in 1983 was awarded an honorary doctorate in laws from the university, and in 1989 appointed an officer of the Order of Australia. An historian committed not just to writing and teaching, but also to support of the discipline, we still order books each year in history from the Pitt bequest, which she established in her will in honour of her father. We have all been watching in disbelief and increasing horror the events unfolding in Ukraine these past 12 weeks or so. In deciding on a presenter for the Kathleen Fitzpatrick lecture, there seemed no one better suited or more immediately available to help explicate these troubling events than our own colleague, Mark Edele. Mark is the Hanson Professor in History here at the University of Melbourne and current Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Arts. Trained as a historian at the universities of Erlangen, Tübingen, Moscow, and Chicago, he is an historian of the Soviet Union and its successor states, in particular Russia. His publications include Soviet Veterans of the Second World War, 2008, Stalinist Society, 2011, Stalin's Defectors, 2017, Shelter from the Holocaust, Rethinking Jewish Survival in the Soviet Union, edited with Atina Grossman and Sheila Fitzpatrick in 2017, The Soviet Union, A Short History in 2019, Debates on Stalinism in 2020, and with Martin Crotty and Neil Diamond, The Politics of Veteran Benefits in the 20th Century, A Comparative History, 2020. His latest book, Stalinism at War, The Soviet Union in World War II, was published in 2021. Mark's lecture tonight is entitled Failed Decolonisation, Russia, Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin. Welcome, Mark.
Good evening, and thank you, Catherine, for this introduction. In July last year, a Russian historian presented a paper which to many other scholars indicated that this colleague was ready for retirement. He claimed that the historical record showed that there was no Ukrainian nation, but that Ukraine had always been unified with Russia. Ukraine was an invention of the Bolsheviks, and the current political rift between Russia and Ukraine was the result of machinations of enemies of Russia's greatness. So what, you might rightfully say, because if I were to detail every problematic article on Russian or Ukrainian history published in the past 10 years or so, this would become a very long evening indeed. The issue here, however, is that the author of On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians was not employed by some third-rate university, but by the Russian state itself. In fact, he ran the thing. So we're talking here about a historian, a certain Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. And his musings on Russian and Ukrainian history turned out to be not just the ravings of an aging man, but an ideological program for an unprovoked war of aggression and conquest. Moreover, his thesis about the non-existence of Ukraine and the Ukrainians can also be heard repeated by commentators in the democratic world, including, lamentably, in this country. Putin's article is, in other words, part of the persistent war of disinformation the Russian state wages on the world in order to confuse hearts and minds. The article is both a piece of ideology and part of a hybrid war to rebuild some version of the Russian Empire. As a Democrat and as a historian, I thus feel a double duty to set the record straight. I am, of course, somewhat sarcastic when calling Putin a historian, but only somewhat. Putin does fancy himself an intellectual. In this respect, he's not so unlike one of his historical heroes. In his later years, Joseph Stalin also turned at least part of the time from managing his entourage and through it his country to scholarship. He wrote a textbook on economics and an article on linguistics. So forceful were Stalin's arguments that they immediately convinced all Soviet scholars. Putin has thus far restricted himself to one field of intellectual endeavor, my own. Before he retreated into his current state of isolation, he liked to mingle with historians and seemed to quite enjoy that. He invited them to meetings where he called them colleagues and berated them to be, quote, objective to the highest degree, while also dropping more or less explicit hints what objective research was meant to find. Moreover, as I pointed out in an earlier critique of Putin's historical writing, what he does write, surely with the help of professionals, are sophisticated, if misleading attempts to learn from history. His theses are not easily dismissed, and engaging with them requires a fairly high level of historical knowledge, of historical analysis, and historical interpretation. Putin clearly reads a lot of history, and he tries to learn from it. He's indeed so devoted to this task that he does not go to war with a neighbor before working out a historical justification for this step. Before we have a closer look at the historian-in-chief's construction of a great Russian history, we need to acquaint ourselves with a few moments in the history of the East Slavs. The first state in the lands of what today is Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia was the state centered in Kiev. Founded in the late 9th century, probably by Vikings sailing down the Dnieper to Byzantium, a theory both Russian and Ukrainian nationalists do not like because it implies that the East Slavs need foreign help to govern themselves. This medieval state united a large number of tribes over a huge territory, from Lakes Onega and Ladoga in the north to the cities Peroslavl and Kiev in the south, from Yaroslavl, Rostov, and Suzdal in the east to the Dniester River in the west. Note that Moscow, a frontier settlement first mentioned in the sources in 1147, is not even on any of these maps. It was way too provincial. In an attempt to find a unifying ideology for the patchwork of peoples and tribes in this expansive realm, Prince Vladimir I shopped around for a religion strong enough to paper over the many divisions of his peoples. In a much-loved passage from the primary chronicle, the first written source for East Slav history, he invites representatives from all major religions to pitch their wares. Ultimately, he chose Christianity over Islam because the latter forbade alcohol, and as the chronicle tells us, this liquid was the joy of the Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure. The Rus thus became Christians in 988, and given Kiev's economic and political ties to Byzantium, the flavor of this Christianity was what would become the Eastern or Orthodox branch. After an initial period of expansion and consolidation of this state from the 980s to 1125, it descended into a period of internal crisis and civil war when a variety of princes competed for power. The disintegration of the Kievan Rus was completed by the Mongol invasion of the 1220s and 1230s. The Mongol invasion was a rift. There was no continuity of statehood between the Kievan Rus and any of the states which today claim its legacy. That includes Russia, that includes Belarus, and it includes Ukraine. They all claim Kievan ancestry, but none of them can show continuity of governance or polity. The lands of the Rus were integrated into the Mongol Empire, and the local princes became tax collectors. Eventually, as the Mongol Empire disintegrated, the provincial town of Moscow became a center of gravity in the northeast from the 1330s onwards. In the 15th century, Muscovy expanded aggressively in what became known as the Gathering of the Land of the Rus, later amended in a more nationalist vein to the Gathering of the Russian Lands. Meanwhile, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania took control of the West, acquiring Kiev in 1362. So the heartland of the old Kievan Empire was actually not under Muscovite control for very long. For 300 years, the Western Rus remained under Lithuanian and then Polish-Lithuanian rule, where their culture and politics evolved in the force field of conflicts between Rus peasants and peasant warriors, the Cossacks, on the one hand, and Polish lords on the other hand, struggles which overlapped with the tensions between Orthodox Christians on the side of the Rus and the state religion of Catholicism on the side of their oppressors. What would become Ukraine then are the lands and peoples of Kievan Rus who lived under Polish influence and domination until the middle of the 17th century. So 300 years of a separate history from the history of what becomes the Russian Empire. Only in 1654, in the Treaty of Pereslav, were much of these lands incorporated into the growing Muscovite state, now called the Tsardom of Russia, the precursor of the Russian Empire, which was named thus in 1721. The integration into Russia in 1654 was most likely a great historical misunderstanding. The contracting parties were an independent Cossack state, the Hetmanat, led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky. He had rebelled against Polish rule in an anti-urban, anti-Polish, anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic, pro-Orthodox bloodbath, which started in 1648. As one of the most accomplished English language historians of Ukraine, Serhiy Yekelchik, points out, the original text of the agreement has been lost. But it is likely from the context and from some other sources we have about it, that the Cossacks thought of this treaty as an alliance between equals, while Tsar Alexei insisted it was a subjugation to his autocratic rule. In line with much of mainstream historiography, mainstream Russian historiography, Putin renders this history in the following manner. He construes an original Russian people going back to Kievan Rus, which was united by the political rule of the princes of Kiev, the Orthodox faith, and a common language, Old Russian, that is Old Church Slavonic, the church language. Something of a wowzer, he does not mention alcohol at all, a joy which also united them and really unites them to this day. He acknowledges that after the decline of the Kievan state and the Mongol invasion, the historical development of northeastern and southwestern Rus was strikingly different, with the former being gathered by the Principality of Moscow, while the latter came under the rule of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, this has no cultural or political impact on the essentially Russian population in his telling, who remain Orthodox and do not speak Polish. Khmelnytsky's uprising he sees not as a Cossack rebellion, but as a liberation movement of essentially Russian people, which leads to the reunification of Russia. Now contrast this with a typical Ukrainian national narrative, which is what he writes against. Here too, Kiev is seen as the origin of the modern nation. But the fall of Kiev, the Mongol invasion, and the existence of the southern lands under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth are acknowledged as having a deep effect on the people of southern Rus. They transformed into Ukrainians, a more European and a more democratically minded East Slavic people than their brethren under the iron fist of the Muscovite princes and later Tsars. As the father of modern Ukrainian historiography, Mikhail Khrushchevsky argued in a short history of his country, published in exile in 1920, quote, "The modern Ukrainian people emerged through a continuous socio-cultural evolution, which was advanced enough by the 17th century that the Ukrainian nationality was decidedly manifest in the 17th century." End of quotation. What once had been a more or less united people of the Kievan Rus had now become, quote, "the three nationalities of the East Slavs, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians," and, quote again, "even their living together under the same scepter later in history could not erase this separation." Khrushchevsky sees the Khmelnytsky uprising as a rebellion of this Ukrainian people against Polish rule, and the union with Moscow, a pragmatic alliance gone bad. Both narratives then project their vision of the people, Ukrainians or Russians, back in time to periods where they did not exist. The peoples of Kiev were Rus, after all, and the Cossacks were just that, Cossacks. Neither were Russians or Ukrainians. But Putin denies the historical contingency of national development much more than Khrushchevsky, who gives his people a history. Putin's Russians, by contrast, are historical only at the point of their genesis in Kievan Rus. Then they remain unchanged, united, universal, essential. After what Putin sees as its reunification in 1654, the great Russian nation thus flourished. Ukrainians in his telling were not repressed or Russified, but integrated into the great imperial project, which indeed linked the Tsarist Empire with the Soviet Union, as you can see in the quotation on this slide. So far, so wonderful. But why did a Ukrainian state then break away from this heartfelt union, formed a new state in 1991, a state which now refuses to subject itself to Russian rule, seeking affiliation with the European Union, and, most horrible of all thoughts, even NATO protection from its brother to the east? What has happened? The great Russian people, thinks Putin, were divided by spoilers: Austrians, Germans, Bolsheviks, the Americans. Correctly noting that a modern Ukrainian identity developed among intellectuals in the 19th century, and that the lands once inhabited by Rus peoples who had ended up in Austria-Hungary after the first partition of Poland in 1772, in particular in Galicia, which was kind of a strong point of the Ukrainian national movement, He blames the Austro-Hungarian government for the rise of a national movement, which in actual historical fact developed organically all over the Western lands of the Rus. The Ukrainian national movement was part of a larger European intellectual fashion of nation-making, kicked off by the French Revolution and fueled by the aesthetics of Romanticism. Sicilians, Sardinians, or Piemontese began to think of themselves as Italians, and an Italian state was formed in 1861. Further north, Austrians, Bavarians, or Prussians began inventing a German nation, which only came into being in 1871, and then only in part of what was seen as the German lands by the intellectual dreamers, many of whom were, like Hrushevsky, historians. All of these new nations invented primordial roots in states and traditions of earlier times, when the unchanging Italian, German, or French nation was allegedly born, just as Hrushevsky did for the Ukrainians or Putin does for the Russians. All of them were wrong, of course. While there always was some kind of ethnic belonging, these ethnicities did not conform to the cultural forms, let alone have the political aspirations of the modern nations as they were imagined in the 19th century, and are still imagined really today. Undergraduate students sometimes mistake the notion that a nation is constructed to mean that they are unreal, which then makes the nationalist fervor with which many of these constructed peoples went to war in 1914 really hard to explain. Putin, whether or not he ever read the literature on the construction of nations, falls into this very trap, because the twin notions of Ukraine and Ukrainians were developed in the 19th century, they must be unreal. In sharp contrast to the allegedly ahistorical Rus is Russian nation, which developed in the Kievan state and is real all along and doesn't change. The problem with Putin's account is that this new Ukrainian identity, developed by intellectuals in the 1860s and the 1870s, began to spread in both the Austro-Hungarian and the Russian empires in the late 19th and early 20th century. The revolution of 1905, which was not just a social and political revolution in Russia, but also a springtime of nations in a multinational empire, gave this growing national movement renewed impetus. And by the time the empire collapsed under the weight of World War I and its own incompetence, there were enough people in Kiev who thought of themselves as Ukrainians that they could unleash not a Russian, but a Ukrainian revolution in 1917. This revolution was not initially anti-Russian. At first, Kiev was in lockstep with Petrograd, where the Tsar had just been toppled. Like the Russian liberals who came to power in February 1917, Ukraine's revolutionaries, led by Hrushevsky, the very historian we already encountered, were intent at keeping the empire together in a democratic polity. What the Central Rada, the revolutionary government of Ukraine, formed in early March 1917 in reaction to the February events in Petrograd, asked in its first universal, its first big announcement, was not independence, but autonomy within a democratic federal Russia, a reformed empire, if you like. This autonomous government claimed jurisdiction over a good part of today's Ukraine, essentially creating Ukraine as a political reality for the first time. Unable to stop this usurpation of power, the Russian provisional government in Petrograd soon recognized the Rada as the regional government of Ukraine. Not even the October coup, which replaced the provisional government in Petrograd with a Bolshevik dictatorship, dampened the determination of Kiev's leaders to remain in the Russian orbit. The Third Universal did proclaim the Ukrainian People's Republic, but it insisted, as you can see on this slide, that it was not separating from the Russian Republic and was indeed maintaining its unity. They were anti-Bolshevik, not anti-Russian. Only when direct confrontation with Bolshevik Petrograd had become the order of the day, with Bolshevik troops on Ukrainian soil marching on Kiev, did the Rada finally proclaim in the Fourth Universal of January 1918 an independent Ukrainian state. This moment, not medieval Kiev, not the early modern Cossack state, this moment is the real origin of modern Ukraine as a nation state. In a diplomatic emergency measure, this new state then made peace with Germany in the First Treaty of Brest-Litovsk of 9 February 1918, before Bolshevik Russia could do the same. Facing German troops on Ukrainian soil, Lenin's fledgling state had to accept in the Second Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that Ukraine was an independent state. This state did not encompass all lands the nationalists imagined were theirs. The Ukrainian lands of Austria-Hungary, an ally of Germany, were excluded, as was Crimea. Moreover, the young nation was subjected to German occupation, to a puppet regime, to fairly severe repression by the occupiers, and in particular forced extraction of grain to feed hungry Germans suffering from the naval blockade of their country. In November 1918, the Germans were defeated at the Western Front, and they began pulling out of Ukraine, which now became embroiled in the wars of the Romanov succession, a bloodbath you probably know under the somewhat misleading term, the Russian Civil War. This term is misleading not only because this civil war entailed Polish, Finnish, Ukrainian, Estonian, or Central Asian elements. It was also fought not only on internal fronts, but also on external fronts between states or proto-states which had emerged from the breakdown of the empire. It thus combined a conglomeration of civil wars with interstate warfare between a bewildering number of states. Ukraine and Bolshevik Russia were by no means the only new political entities which initially emerged from the breakdown of the Romanov Empire in 1917-18. By the middle of 1918, no less than 30 governments were in existence on the territory of the shattered Russian Empire. Soon, they started fighting each other as well as parts of their respective populations. Ukraine became a major frontline in these complex struggles, weakened by internal rebellions and left by the Germans without an army at a time others had built theirs, in particular Bolshevik Russia and Poland. The new state was eliminated and its lands were divided in 1921 between the two of the more successful successor states of the Romanov Empire, Poland and Bolshevik Russia. So the disappearance of Ukraine as an independent state in those years is a result of a lack of military power on the state of the on the side of the Ukrainian government. However, the Ukrainians had fought so hard and their national consciousness seemed so strong that Lenin, a Marxist and an enemy of nationalism as a Marxist, but also a pragmatic politician able to see political realities, insisted Ukraine be integrated as a national unit, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This was a totally new thing. There had been no territory called Ukraine in the Romanov Empire. The only Ukrainian territory was the Ukrainian territory of that independent state of 1917-21. This model of integrating non-Russian regions as national entities into the Soviet Union, this model was then applied to other non-Russian regions of the growing Soviet Empire. This new empire of nations was a contradictory structure. On the one hand, it had regathered much of the lands of the Romanovs under the red flag and thus seemed to be a successor of the old empire. On the other hand, its leaders tried to avoid the appearance of what they called Great Russian Chauvinism in a state dominated by Russians and Russian speakers, but with a sizable, about half of the population being non-Russians. Confusingly, moreover, this new empire was ideologically devoted to anti-imperialism and decolonization, which would lead to endless squabbles among historians about whether or not it was indeed an empire, given that it constantly talked about not being one and being actually opposed to the very idea of empire. The role in the establishment of the Ukrainian SSR, of the imperial breakdown of World War I, and the following wars of the Roman of succession is crucial. This period, 1917 to 21, is absolutely crucial. Developments in this period linked the national movement of the 19th century with the first Ukrainian state of 1917-21, which in turn inspired the creation of the Ukrainian Republic within the Soviet Union, the entity which would then emerge as an independent state from the rubble of the Soviet Union in 1991, and thus establishes the state of Ukraine as we know it today. Of course, these different states were not all the same, and what it meant to be Ukrainian changed over time and continues to change, as we shall see. Ukraine, like any other nation state, has a history. That does not mean that it's an artificial creation. But that is exactly the impression Putin wants to convey in his article. His account leaves out any mention of Bolshevik aggression against the new Ukrainian state and the role of this aggression by Bolshevik Russia, played in the Declaration of Independence and the peace treaty with Germany in 1918. He obscures all continuities between the various Ukrainian regimes of 1918-21, instead telling a story of rupture after rupture. Ukrainian regimes and Ukrainian national consciousness are unreal forces in his telling, motivated only by foreign powers intent at dominating Russia, first Austria and Germany, then Poland. Ukrainians have no agency in this narrative. They are nothing but puppets of nefarious outside forces. Ukraine as a state and as a nation is the artificial creation of Bolshevism, a somewhat mysterious event in Putin's rendering, given that the Bolsheviks were Marxists and as such enemies of nationalism and the nation state. Why would they create a Ukrainian nation if there wasn't one before? For Putin then, there's no Ukrainian nation until the Bolsheviks constructed it out of thin air. Note also that he sees the creation of the USSR from the rubble of the Tsarist Empire as the foundation of our statehood. That's kind of hidden in the middle of this paragraph I have on the slide here. Modern Russia to him is continuous with both the Soviet Union and its predecessor, the Romanov Empire, which in turn he links to Kievan Rus, which formed the eternal Russian people. So this is a very deep history for Putin, right? Contemporary Ukraine, meanwhile, has nothing to do with the Kievan Rus or with the Cossack Hetmanate in his telling. It was born from the naive acceptance by Lenin of a propaganda construct of Russia's enemies, Germans, Austrians, Poles. Meanwhile, Russia is eternal, the successor of the Kievan Rus, which gathered all the lands of the Russians, who include the Ukrainians and the Belarusians. Back to real history. The Ukrainian Republic, as it formed in 1917 to 21 and was then incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1922, was not territorial identical with today's Ukraine. Over the 7 long decades of Soviet power, a variety of border changes took place. You can see the border changes on this map here, most notably the annexation of parts of Western Poland, of Romania and Czechoslovakia, parts of Romania and Czechoslovakia during World War II, and the transfer of Crimea from the Russian Republic within the Soviet Union to the Ukrainian Republic within the Soviet Union in 1954. The latter is the source for the Russian claim that Crimea had always been Russian. In the East, some territories were transferred to Russia in 1924 and to Moldova in 1940. It was this Ukraine which became independent in 1991, and Putin is right to point out that this territory and the people living within it were in parts result of Soviet history. Both Ukraine as a state and the Ukrainians as a nation were thus historically constructed. But it is worth noting what kind of a construct the contemporary Ukrainian nation is. There are 2 competing models. an exclusionary ethnic and an inclusionary civic identity. In the former, in the ethnic one, only people who speak Ukrainian as their first language and consider themselves shaped by a wider Ukrainian culture are seen as Ukrainians. At the margins of politics, there's of course a racist rendering of this, people of Ukrainian blood are Ukrainians, but that's actually quite marginal. In the latter, in the civic version, anybody who is a citizen of the democratic polity built within the borders of Ukraine and is loyal to that democratic polity is seen as Ukrainian, no matter if that person speaks Russian or is of Jewish heritage or is a descendant of the Crimean Tatars or other ethnic groups. Remarkably, over the course of the tumultuous history of Ukraine since 1991, the Orange Revolution of 2004-05, the Revolution of Dignity or the Euromaidan of 2013-14, the Russian annexation of Crimea and the Russian-sponsored war in the Donbass since 2014, it was the civic version of Ukrainian national consciousness that won out, not the ethnic one, as one might expect in times of turmoil and war. In 2019, in the middle of a war against Russian-backed rebels in Donbass, Ukraine opted against ethnic nationalism and for its civic sibling. It elected not the Ukrainian ethno-nationalist Petro Poroshenko, but the Russian-speaking Jew Volodymyr Zelensky as its president. And in the current war in Ukraine, this multi-ethnic and civil nationalism, this is our country, we defend our freedoms, has played an enormous role in mobilizing the citizens of the state of Ukraine to fight and die for their country, no matter what their religion, ethnicity, or mother tongue. It is noteworthy, for example, that one of the most famous slogans emerging from this war, Ruski voyenny kорабль, иди нахуй, Russian military vessel, fuck off, was uttered in Russian, not in Ukrainian, and it is promoted as such, as you can see on this poster here. This is Russian, this is not Ukrainian. And in what other country would a video of the president, before he was president, clad in skin-tight leather and dancing in high heels while poking fun at national icons, the Cossacks, increase his popularity? If you can, substitute in your mind the Australian Prime Minister for Zelensky and the Anzacs for the Cossacks. This begs the question then, why Putin's Russia is so obsessed with Ukraine. The official justification of the current war is twofold. Ukraine is a fascist state and as such a threat to Russia, and Ukraine is an outpost of NATO and as such also a threat to Russia. Both claims are ludicrous, and they don't become less so by constantly being repeated by fellow travelers of Putin's regime, including in this country. As far as fascism is concerned, in the 2019 elections, the combined far-right parties won a total of 2.3% of the vote. Meanwhile, the Jew Zelensky was elected president with over 73% of the vote, some fascist nation. And NATO? As two political scientists have pointed out in a recent article in the Journal of Democracy, there's no correlation between actual NATO expansion and Russian aggression, but there's a very strong correlation between Russian aggression and moments which advance democracy at Russia's border. International politics, thus, is an expression of internal developments in Russia itself. Putin's state has become ever more authoritarian, culminating in today's state, which can probably be safely described as a 21st century version of fascism. This destruction of democracy has been legitimized by a Russian culture. Critics are accused of Western cultural imperialism. Managed democracy, Putin's apologists claim, is a culturally specific form of Russian democracy. East Slavs, we are told, do democracy differently. The existence of a vibrant democracy next door among a brotherly East Slav people prone to revolt against kleptocrats and would-be dictators, then, is a threat to this culturalist defense of authoritarianism. East Slavs, it turns out, do democracy perfectly well. The assault on Ukraine, both with propaganda and with tanks, is part of what La Trobe University's Robert Horvath has described as Putin's preventive counter-revolution. It's the foreign policy equivalent of the suppression of civil society in the interior. The second reason why Ukraine needs to be destroyed is because Putin, along with many other Russians and quite a few outside observers, has failed to decolonize his mind. He seems unable to distinguish Russia from the Russian Empire. The Russian nation for him cannot exist without the imperial state. This lack of imagination is rooted in a specific but widespread reading of Russian history, which elevates an important strand of the Russian experience to its unchanging essence, the fact that the Russian state and the Russian Empire evolved together. Russia then never had an empire. It was one from the start. And this slide gives you a kind of a genealogy of that idea of Russia never having an empire, but being one. From the very start, it was hard to decide where the metropole ended and the periphery started, where the heartland was and where were the colonies. While Moscow acquired good chunks of the lands of the southwestern Rus only in 1654, and the city of Kiev, and thus the heartland of the old Kievan Rus, only in 1667, it long gathered lands which were not Rus at all. From at least the conquest of Kazan in 1552 and the subsequent subjugation of Siberia in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Muscovite state was not a national homeland of East Slavs or, if you wish, of Russians. It was a multinational empire. Economically, this empire was based first on the extraction of furs, in particular sable, from Siberia, a most brutal form of colonialism, which led to the extermination not only of the animals, but also of many of the indigenous peoples of this space who were forced to hunt them and hand over the furs, right? Once the sables were no more, the Muscovite state financed its further expansion through one of the most brutal forms of serfdom Europe had seen, which by the 19th century resembled the actual enslavement of the East Slavic population, that is Russians and Ukrainians. Serfdom was abolished, first in the Baltic territories in 1816-19, then in the empire as a whole in 1861. And a concerted effort was made to put the empire on a new economic footing by massive efforts at industrialization, flanked by agricultural exports. The resulting social, political, and cultural crisis, together with the incompetence of the last Tsar and the strains of World War I, broke apart the empire, but the majority of it was soon reborn as the Soviet Union, also a multinational empire, as we have already seen. And while this empire eventually broke apart into 15 successor states in 1991, Russia was the largest of them, and it remained multinational. According to the 2010 census, 19% of the population are non-Russian minorities, complicating any straightforward ethno-national nation building. This entanglement of the histories of the Russian state and the Russian Empire makes constructing a post-imperial Russian national consciousness difficult, both intellectually and emotionally. In Ukraine, decolonization of history meant national awakening. In Russia, it threatened loss of self. However, it is not impossible to construct a post-colonial Russian consciousness. In fact, this was exactly what many liberal Russian historians tried to do ever since the 1980s. If it is impossible historically or logically to divorce the Russian state from the Russian Empire, there never was a Russian state that was not colonial, right? Then one way to free the Russian nation from its imperial past is to divorce the Russian people from the Russian state. After all, Ukrainians and other non-Russians were not the only ones victimized by the empire. Enserfment, the economic base of imperial expansion after all the sables had been killed, oppressed Russian peasants as much as it did Ukrainians under the old regime. Under the new regime, Russians suffered terribly under Stalin. While there were dissidents among non-Russians later in the Soviet Union, Russian dissenters were treated no better and were no less ubiquitous among the intelligentsia in the 1960s and 1970s. It is thus completely possible to write a history of the Russian people as one of exploitation and victimization by the Russian imperial state, a tradition in Russian historiography which also goes back as far as the 19th century, just like the one which is focusing on the state, and which has been revived in fits and starts during moments in Soviet times. Since the 1980s, historians and community activists have led to a blossoming of this literature, most prominently promoted by the Memorial Society, founded in 1989 to preserve the memory of Stalinist repression. It is no coincidence that Memorial was outlawed last year after years of harassment by the state. The kind of history Memorial and its historians promoted implied that each Russian person, as well as the Russian nation in the aggregate, are valuable in themselves, independent of their service or lack of service to the state ruling over them. This in turn implies that the state needs to be civilized, tamed, controlled, which implies democracy rather than dictatorship. As such, this history is not very useful for a man who has stolen so much from the Russian people that he now cannot retire for fear of ending his years in prison, prosecuted for treason by a hypothetical but still feared democratic Russia. The empire, it turns out, is the final refuge of the kleptocrat Putin. Hence the war in Ukraine. Thank you.
Well, Mark, thank you for giving us an extraordinary overview of a very complex history. All of those maps kind of burnt into my mind. So thank you so very much. And it's just a shame we can't have a whole audience kind of all clapping in unison to thank you for quite a magnificent and enlightening lecture.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no, our privilege, Mark. Thank you. So we now move on to the Ernest Scott Prize. So we move from a kind of more, a very sobering kind of account from Mark to altogether a celebration of fine historical work. The Ernest Scott Prize for History is awarded annually by the Faculty of Arts, and it's named after, obviously, Ernest Scott, who was born in 1867 and died in 1939. And he was appointed Chair of History at the University of Melbourne in 1913. His research and personal qualities being considered to outweigh his lack of academic qualifications and experience. But he proved to be a born teacher, an admirable lecturer, a first-rate administrator, as well as being a prodigious worker. Now, the Ernest Scott Prize, which is named after him, is awarded to the best book based on original research, judged to be the most distinguished contribution to the history of Australia or New Zealand, or to the history of colonisation. And in 2022, the prize has been adjudicated by a stellar team. Tom Griffiths, AO, W.K. Hancock Professor Emeritus in the School of History at the Australian National University, and Angela Wanhalla, Professor of History at the University of Otago. Angela specialises in Maori, New Zealand, and women's history. Her research focuses on the intersections between gender, race, and sexuality in colonial history, with a specific focus on the connections between race and intimacy within and across colonial cultures. In addition to her work on the history of marriage and the family, Angela also has an interest in material and visual culture, particularly the history of photography. Tom, himself a former recipient of the Ernest Scott Prize, is the chair of the editorial board of the Australian Dictionary of Biography and director of the Centre for Environmental History at ANU. His research, writing and teaching are in the fields of Australian social, cultural and environmental history, public history, comparative global environmental history, the writing of non-fiction and the history of Antarctica. His books and essays have won prizes in history, science, literature, politics, and journalism, including, as well as the Ernest Scott Prize, the Douglas Stewart Prize for Nonfiction, the Eureka Science Book Prize, the Alfred Deakin Prize for an essay advancing public debate, and the Prime Minister's Prize for Australian history. So a really intimidating and fantastic adjudication team there. They had a huge task. There was a total of 77 books entered for consideration for the Ernest Scott Prize. So profound thanks to both these judges for their extraordinary and no doubt in the end very difficult job in assessing the winning entries. They have shortlisted 5 books. The first is Bain Attwood's Empire and the Making of Native Title, Sovereignty, Property and Indigenous People, published by Cambridge University Press. This book is a rigorous and conceptually expansive comparative history written with precision and clarity. Focused on Victoria, South Australia and New Zealand, Bain Attwood offers a historiographically robust and archivally rich account of how native title was made through treaty talk by colonial politicians, humanitarians, the New Zealand Company, and later by historians. In doing so, Attwood poses questions about the role and duty of the historian to the past and to truth, what he calls its messy complexity. His answer is a multi-layered comparative approach to illuminate how property rights and sovereignty were dynamic and contested ideas in the colonies and in London. The second shortlisted book, and in fact, you needed to have the surname M or Mick, in fact, to make it to the shortlisted group here, it would seem. Lucy McIntosh for Shifting Grounds, Deep Histories of Tamaki Makarau Auckland. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This beautifully produced, absorbing book is a treat to read. Through a combination of evocative prose, clarity of argument, and well-chosen images, Lucy McIntosh delivers immersive, deep histories of 3 Auckland sites and its peoples with care and compassion. Landscapes, the built environment, and other wordless records are McIntosh's archives. She brings places into life from multiple perspectives, arguing that material and human worlds are agents of history. In Shifting Grounds, Auckland's landscapes are saturated with power and domination, as well as delicate human stories that reveal histories of connection across deep time. And the second of our mix here, Janet McCalman for Vandemonians, The Repressed History of Colonial Victorians, published by the Magana Press. The Vandemonians were the generation of ex-convicts who crossed Bass Strait to lose themselves in Port Phillip and Victoria, seeking to escape their demonized past. Janet McCalman draws on the paper panopticon, the administration of the penal system, digital newspaper archives, court records, and the techniques of prosopography and historical demography to weave a tapestry of secret and intimate histories. The convict experience is analysed in the full context of the life course of individuals, singularly and in a crowd. This lucidly written historical study carries important lessons for our treatment today of the poor, the unwell, and the disabled, the unprotected, abused, and unloved. The third of our mix is Mark McKenna for Return to Uluru, published by Black Ink. Return to Uluru tells the story of the shooting and killing of an Aboriginal man, Yokonana, by a white policeman, Bill McKinnon, in a cave at Uluru in 1934. Because of where the tragedy unfolded, the narrative becomes a powerful parable about death and redemption in the heart of Australia. McKenna's brilliant storytelling and delicate exploration of the ethics of cross-cultural research makes this a luminous and compelling narrative. His research leads to revelatory conversations with the descendants of both protagonists and to disturbing archival and museum discoveries. Return to Uluru is an exhilarating performance of the historian's craft, an exposition of what truth-telling might entail in the time of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And finally, Henry Reynolds for Truth-Telling, History, Sovereignty, and the Uluru Statement, published by New South Publishing. Truth-telling elucidates the full majesty and historical depth of the Uluru Statement. and places it in the context of more than 200 years of history and law. Henry Reynolds draws on his lifetime of pioneering scholarship to expose and examine the denial at the heart of Australia's foundation. He argues that the choice not to pursue treaty making in Australia laid the ground for a much more violent frontier. He also directs attention to the second phase of conquest, when colonists pushed above the Tropic of Capricorn, observing that this was not a British imperial project, but an Australian one, scripted into the identity of the nation. Written with clarity, insight, and moral power, Reynolds brings timely perspective and understanding to current debates about constitutional reform. The decision was obviously not easy, and Tom and Angela have made a joint award to Lucy McIntosh and Professor Janet McCalman. So many congratulations to both of them. In awarding the prize, the judges praised Shifting Grounds as a beautifully produced, absorbing book, and described Vandemonians as a profoundly original and compassionate work of history. Now, normally we would invite the winners to join us at the podium, and instead, because we're online, of course, the winners have each provided a short statement, which I'll read for you. So Lucy McIntosh says, "I'm absolutely thrilled to be awarded the Ernest Scott Prize for 2022, alongside the co-winner, Janet McCalman. It's a huge honour to be amongst the recipients of this award, many of whom have profoundly influenced my own work. I would like to acknowledge the other excellent and important books on the shortlist and thank the University of Melbourne for supporting this prize. I'm delighted that Shifting Grounds has resonated both within and beyond Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm grateful to the team at Bridget Williams Books for their commitment and support for this book, and to all of those who generously shared their time and expertise with me while I was writing it. Shifting Grounds explores the layered textured histories that are situated in particular places, but it also examines the links between those histories and the broader historical context of the city, the nation, and the globe. What emerges are deep and complex histories, both natural and human, that underpin Auckland, but have not made it into the city's monuments, history books, or collective memory. Vandemonians, the repressed history of colonial Victorians, is a profoundly original and compassionate work of history that showcases new methods of collective biography to deliver fresh insights on every page about Australia's colonial foundations. Professor Janet McCalman said she was honoured and delighted to be chosen as the 2022 joint winner, and expressed her gratitude to the judges for her selection. So many congratulations again to both of you. And a reminder to all of you here tonight that the winners of this prize then present a lecture in the second half of the year. So please watch this space for notifications of those lectures. I'll just share screening before I stop sharing my screen before I wrap up. So before I close this webinar, I'd like to thank those who've assisted in bringing this evening together. To Leanne Hunt, personal assistant to the head of school and our wonderful organiser of school events. Matthew Champion, our history engagement representative. Julie Fedor, the school engagement representative. Emma Sakoulis, the faculty's gift implementation coordinator, who's coordinated the work involved in the Ernest Scott Prize. Becky Clifton, our ever sunny technical assistant, who ensures the webinars are a stress-free technical experience for those of us involved in delivering them, as for you in receiving them, and to Danny Puopolo for assistance with the presentation. And thank you to all of you for logging in this evening. Good night.